Hello and welcome to the unseen question. Why do people hate atheists? That might sound like a loaded question, but it's a very real one. Surveys show that in many countries, atheists are some of the least trusted groups, sometimes even less trusted than people with criminal records. In the United States, for example, polls have found that large numbers of people say they wouldn't want their child to marry an atheist, or wouldn't vote for an openly atheist president. This isn't just a matter of mild discomfort. It's about suspicion, stigma, and in some parts of the world, outright persecution. But why? What exactly is it about not believing in gods that provokes such strong feelings? At first glance, the answer might seem simple. People grow up immersed in religious cultures, and anyone who steps outside of that is seen as an outsider. But the truth is more layered. The dislike toward atheists isn't just about being different. It's tied to how religion has shaped morality, identity, and even tribal instincts over thousands of years. One of the biggest reasons atheists face hostility is the assumption that morality depends on belief in God. Many religious traditions teach that rules about right and wrong come directly from a divine source. So when someone says they don't believe in that source, it can sound, at least to a religious person, like they're rejecting morality altogether. To them, an atheist isn't just someone who disagrees about the existence of God. It feels like someone who doesn't recognize any rules at all. Of course, that idea doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Entire societies have legal systems, ethical frameworks, and cultural norms that don't come from Scripture. In fact, some of the most peaceful, least corrupt countries in the world today, like Sweden, Denmark, and New Zealand, are also some of the least religious. If morality really depended on belief in a God, those countries should be chaotic wastelands. Instead, they consistently rank high in happiness, education, and social trust. But many people don't look at data or history when forming their attitudes. They rely on inherited assumptions. And one of the strongest inherited assumptions is that without religion, people would lose their moral compass. That's one major reason atheists are distrusted. Another factor is identity. Religion often serves as a marker of belonging. In many communities, being religious isn't just about belief. It's about showing loyalty to your group. Going to church, mosque, or temple signals that you're one of us. It's like wearing a uniform. So when someone opts out, they're not just saying they don't share the belief. They're also signaling they don't fully belong to the tribe. This can trigger a deep social suspicion. Humans evolved to be wary of outsiders because in small tribal groups, outsiders could pose a threat. Even today, those instincts remain. If religion is used as a marker of who can I trust, then atheists automatically become the ones I can't trust. Not because they've done anything wrong, but simply because they don't carry the badge of faith. Sometimes this distrust takes on stranger forms. Studies have shown that when people are asked to imagine an untrustworthy person, many instinctively imagine an atheist, even without being prompted. That bias is powerful. It shows up in hiring decisions, in politics, and even in family relationships. People often describe feeling nervous about admitting they don't believe, fearing it might affect their career or personal life. Of course, this isn't uniform everywhere. In some regions, being non-religious is so normal that it barely registers. But in places where religion is tightly woven into cultural and political life, the stigma can be overwhelming. Part of the hostility also comes from a fear of questioning authority. Religions often claim not only to teach morality, but also to offer ultimate answers. Life, death, purpose, meaning, all wrapped up in a neat package. When someone says they don't believe in that package, it can feel destabilizing to those who rely on it. It's like shaking the foundation of their worldview. People don't just hear, I don't believe in God. They hear, I think your deepest convictions might be wrong. That can feel threatening, even if it wasn't intended that way. But there's another angle worth exploring. Hatred toward atheists is sometimes less about theology and more about power. Religious institutions have historically held enormous influence, socially, politically, and economically. When someone refuses to participate in that system, they're harder to control. They're less likely to vote a certain way just because a priest or pastor says so. They're less likely to give money to religious institutions. In that sense, atheists represent a kind of independence that powerful religious authorities may find inconvenient. This tension has been visible throughout history. From the Inquisition, where doubters were tortured, to the accusations of godlessness during the Cold War, being seen as outside the dominant faith often made someone a target. Labeling people as dangerous or immoral because they didn't believe that was a way of keeping the group unified and obedient. But hostility doesn't always come from institutions. Sometimes it comes from individuals who feel personally unsettled by atheism. If someone's entire life is built on the idea of divine order, meeting someone who rejects that can create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. It forces them to confront the possibility that they might be wrong. And rather than wrestling with that uncomfortable thought, it's often easier to demonize the person who caused it. That discomfort can manifest in very subtle ways. Someone might avoid conversations with a non-believer, or they might crack jokes at their expense. In more extreme cases, it becomes outright hostility, treating atheists as if they are untrustworthy, selfish, or even dangerous. These reactions aren't really about the atheists themselves. They're about the believer protecting their own sense of certainty. It's worth noting how much of this fear is built on misunderstandings. For example, studies in psychology and sociology show that non-religious people tend to donate to charity at similar or even higher rates than religious people, especially when you include secular charities. They also tend to be just as cooperative in experiments testing fairness and trust. Yet the stereotype persists that someone who doesn't believe in God must only be out for themselves. The evidence says otherwise, but old assumptions are slow to die. Another layer comes from cultural memory. In many societies, religion has long been tied to patriotism or national identity. In the United States, phrases like, "In God we trust," or "one nation under God," create an atmosphere where being religious is linked to being a good citizen. In that context, atheists aren't just seen as people with different beliefs. They're painted as un-American or disloyal to the community. That stigma doesn't fade easily, and in other parts of the world, similar patterns exist. Religion tied to ethnicity, nationality, or heritage. Rejecting the faith, then, can be seen as rejecting your people, your ancestors, or your culture. This helps explain why family tensions can be so intense. When someone stops believing, relatives sometimes take it as a personal betrayal. It's not just about private belief. It feels like a rejection of family tradition, or even of love. That's why conversations about religion within families can turn bitter so quickly. The disagreement is rarely just intellectual. It touches on identity, belonging, and loyalty. But let's step back. If atheists are distrusted because people assume they have no morals, or because they're seen as disloyal to tradition, or because their existence challenges other people's certainty, all of these are, in essence, projections. They're not reflections of who atheists actually are. They're reflections of fears and anxieties in the minds of believers. And fears, once rooted in culture, can be very difficult to uproot. At the same time, hostility toward atheists isn't universal. In societies with strong secular traditions, mistrust is far lower. This suggests that the stigma isn't inevitable, it's learned. And anything that is learned can, in principle, be unlearned. Take the example of Scandinavia. In places like Sweden, being non-religious is so ordinary that it's barely noticed. Surveys there show high levels of trust in neighbors and institutions, despite the fact that belief in God is relatively rare. That directly challenges the assumption that religion is necessary for social cohesion. It shows that morality and trust can thrive without constant reference to the divine. So why hasn't that realization spread more widely? One reason is that religious institutions often tell a particular story. Without faith, civilization would crumble. This story is repeated in sermons, in schools, in politics, and once people believe it, they start to fear those who don't fit into it. Fear then justifies prejudice. But it's important to see the bigger picture. Prejudice against atheists is part of a broader pattern. Humans often distrust groups they don't understand. For centuries, people have demonized outsiders of all kinds. Foreigners, minorities, people with different lifestyles. Atheists just happen to fall into one of those outsider categories, particularly in societies where religion is deeply tied to identity. And sometimes, hostility toward atheists is deliberately exaggerated by leaders who benefit from having an enemy. If a politician wants to rally support, framing themselves as a defender of faith against godless forces can be effective. The Cold War is a prime example. American politicians use the label godless communism, not just to describe a political system, but to make atheism itself sound like a threat to freedom. It was propaganda that stuck. Even today, echoes of that association linger. But here's something worth considering. When people are asked privately about their values, kindness, honesty, compassion, responsibility, the answers don't differ much between religious and non-religious respondents. What differs is the story they attach to those values. One person says, "I try to be kind because that's what my faith teaches." Another says, "I try to be kind because I believe it makes life better for everyone." The outcome is the same, but the labels are different. Unfortunately, those labels often matter more in people's minds than the actual behaviors. If someone hears that their neighbor doesn't believe in God, they may jump to conclusions, ignoring years of evidence that the neighbor is trustworthy and kind. That shows just how powerful cultural narratives can be. Facts don't always win against fear, at least not right away. This raises a question. What would it take for people to see atheists differently? The answer may not lie in abstract arguments about philosophy. It may come down to familiarity. Research consistently shows that people who personally know an atheist are more likely to view atheists positively. Prejudice weakens when the outsider becomes a friend, coworker, or family member. In other words, exposure humanizes. That suggests an important point. The stigma around atheism isn't an unchangeable law of human nature. It's a social habit, reinforced by institutions, traditions, and fear. And habits can shift when people start encountering reality instead of stereotypes. Still, change is slow, and for many atheists, the hostility feels heavy. In some parts of the world, declaring unbelief can still carry real risks, from losing jobs to being ostracized or even punished by law. In others, the hostility is softer but still persistent. Quiet suspicion, jokes that cut deep, or being treated as if you can't be trusted with responsibility. It's worth recognizing how strange this really is. Disliking someone, not because of what they've done, but because of what they don't believe. It's one of the last socially acceptable prejudices in many places. And yet, when examined closely, the reasons don't hold up. They collapse under the weight of evidence, history, and reason. When we look at the psychology behind this prejudice, one recurring theme is fear of uncertainty. Belief systems often provide a sense of order, promising that life has meaning, that good will be rewarded, and that suffering has a purpose. When someone rejects that framework, it can feel like they're embracing chaos. Even if that's not true, the perception is powerful. People might think, if there's no higher power keeping track, then what's to stop cruelty or injustice? But ironically, research shows that people who don't believe in divine oversight often take more personal responsibility for their actions. Without the idea that someone else will handle justice in the afterlife, the responsibility to create fairness here and now feels more urgent. In that sense, the absence of belief doesn't lead to apathy. It can lead to a deeper sense of accountability. Still, perception lags far behind reality. Centuries of religious teaching have ingrained the idea that morality and divinity are inseparable. Many children are taught from a young age that if God didn't exist, nothing would stop people from stealing, lying, or hurting one another. That narrative becomes so deeply embedded that even adults who don't strictly believe it may still feel uneasy around someone who openly rejects religion. There's also the issue of existential comfort. Religion offers consoling stories. Loved ones are in a better place. Suffering has a purpose. Death is not the end. These stories ease some of the hardest parts of human existence. When someone says they don't believe in those stories, it can feel like they're taking away hope. That's not the intention, of course, but it can explain the defensiveness. It's not just a philosophical disagreement. It touches raw emotions around death, grief, and meaning. Some hostility even comes from envy or resentment. People who begin doubting their own beliefs sometimes project anger onto those who've already let go of them. It's easier to resent someone who lives openly without faith than to confront your own doubts. This is part of what makes discussions about belief so emotionally charged. They're not just debates about evidence, they're reflections of people's deepest insecurities. But there's another factor we can't ignore: power structures. For centuries, organized religion has been intertwined with authority. Kings, emperors, parliaments, presidents. Questioning belief has often meant questioning power. When someone says they don't believe in God, that rejection also weakens the influence of those who claim to speak for God. And that's threatening to institutions built on religious authority. That's why throughout history, doubters weren't just seen as misguided, they were seen as dangerous. A person who doesn't accept divine authority is less likely to obey blindly. They might ask uncomfortable questions, resist dogma, or challenge hierarchies. From the perspective of power, this is a problem, which is why so many leaders, both religious and political, worked hard to portray atheists as corrupt, immoral, or even monstrous. The stigma was never just about belief, it was about maintaining control. Even in modern times, traces of this remain. When politicians invoke faith as a prerequisite for leadership, they're not just appealing to voters' piety. They're reinforcing the idea that morality and governance are inseparable from religion. By painting unbelievers as unfit to lead, they protect a system where faith and power are intertwined. It's worth asking, if atheists are consistently painted as untrustworthy, who benefits from that perception? Often it's those who want to preserve religious privilege. If society starts trusting nonbelievers equally, then the claim that religion has a special authority over morals, laws, or policies begins to crumble. And for those invested in that authority, that's a genuine threat. On the personal level, though, the hostility often comes from simpler sources. Fear of difference, discomfort with uncertainty, protection of identity. These are deeply human reactions, but they're also irrational. Distrusting someone simply because they don't share your belief about gods makes no more sense than distrusting someone because they prefer a different type of music. Yet because religion deals with ultimate questions of life and death, the emotional weight is far heavier. Some examples highlight this vividly. In surveys where people are asked who they would trust to babysit their children, atheists often score lower than almost any other group, not because there's evidence of danger, but because the mere absence of religious belief triggers suspicion. Or consider jury trials. In certain regions, lawyers know that jurors are less likely to trust a witness if they identify as atheist. These are real-world consequences of a prejudice that has little grounding in reality. And in some countries, the consequences are even harsher. In places where religious law dominates, openly rejecting belief can lead to imprisonment or even death. In those societies, the hatred isn't just social, it's codified into law. And again, this isn't because atheists behave worse, but because the system needs to guard its authority. When belief becomes compulsory, non-belief becomes the ultimate rebellion. What's fascinating is how quickly this hostility fades when people interact on a personal level. Countless stories exist of religious individuals who distrusted atheists in the abstract, but changed their view after befriending one. The stereotype doesn't hold up in the face of actual experience, which shows that much of the hatred isn't about reality at all. It's about imagined fears, passed down through tradition and reinforced by institutions. If that's the case, then hostility toward atheists might not be permanent. It may diminish as more people see non-believers living ordinary, ethical, and fulfilling lives. Every time someone sees that morality doesn't collapse without religion, the narrative weakens. Slowly, perception shifts, but until then, the prejudice remains powerful. And what makes it especially frustrating is that it's often invisible to those who hold it. A person might say, I don't hate atheists, I just wouldn't trust them as much. Or, I don't dislike non-believers, but I don't think they should be leaders. They don't hear the contradiction, that these positions are forms of discrimination. Just like saying, I don't hate women, but I don't think they should run companies. The fact that many people don't even recognize their bias shows how normalized it has become. Hatred toward atheists often hides under the language of caution, tradition, or morality, but underneath it's still prejudice. One of the less discussed roots of hostility is how deeply religion ties itself to concepts of trustworthiness. In many places, people still swear oaths on holy books in courtrooms. Politicians end speeches with religious blessings. Athletes thank God after victories. All of these rituals send the same message. Morality, honesty, and reliability are linked to religious belief. So when someone doesn't fit that mold, suspicion feels automatic. But here's the irony. Linking morality to belief in the supernatural is actually a fairly recent idea in human history. Early human groups long before organized religion still had rules of fairness, reciprocity, and cooperation. Archaeology and anthropology show that small communities developed moral systems simply to survive. You can't have a functioning tribe if everyone lies, steals, or cheats. So morality emerged from human needs, not divine commands. Religion came later and claimed ownership of it. This distinction matters, because if morality is older than religion, then the claim that unbelievers lack morals is upside down. Morality doesn't come from gods. Gods were explanations tacked on to morality. And yet, because this story has been told for centuries, many still believe it. And that belief fuels suspicion toward those who step outside the framework. Another underdiscussed reason people hate atheists is simple projection. Many believers think, if I didn't believe in God, I would feel free to do terrible things. And then they assume everyone else would behave the same way. But that projection says more about their own internal struggles than about reality. If someone believes the only thing holding them back from cruelty is fear of punishment, that reveals a lot about their psychology. For people who don't share that mindset, morality is grounded in empathy, reason, and responsibility, not fear of divine surveillance. There's also the role of storytelling. Myths, parables, and religious tales often cast unbelievers as villains. Think of how often the wicked or the foolish are those who reject the divine. These stories shape culture over generations, embedding the idea that disbelief equals danger. Even if most people don't take those tales literally, the imagery lingers. A culture that has painted skeptics as corrupt for centuries doesn't erase those associations overnight. Education also plays a role. In some school systems, religion isn't just taught as an option. It's taught as the foundation of morality and history. Students grow up hearing that civilizations collapse without faith, that atheism leads to nihilism and despair. These lessons shape impressions long before critical thinking develops. So by the time people encounter a non-believer, they're already carrying a suitcase of assumptions. Now consider the media. In many films and TV shows, religious characters are portrayed as virtuous, while godless characters are often framed as cold, cynical, or immoral. Even when it's subtle, this pattern reinforces the stereotype, and it's rarely challenged. It would be almost unthinkable in mainstream media to depict a devout believer as untrustworthy because of their faith, but the reverse happens constantly. When you add up all these influences, history, institutions, family, media, you see why the suspicion runs so deep. It's not just one thing. It's layer upon layer of cultural reinforcement, all pointing in the same direction. If you don't believe, you can't be trusted. But the truth is, those narratives break down the moment you look at real-world outcomes. Countries with lower religiosity consistently show lower crime rates, higher social trust, and better quality of life. Studies of prison populations often reveal that religious groups are overrepresented compared to their share of the general population, while non-believers are underrepresented. If the stereotype were true, the opposite should be happening. Yet facts rarely win over fears when people are defending their identity. It's also telling how the hatred shifts depending on context. In majority Christian societies, atheists are distrusted. In majority Muslim societies, non-Muslims and atheists are distrusted. In Hindu majority societies, it's the same. What this shows is that the distrust isn't unique to one religion. It's a byproduct of majority belief. Whoever steps outside the dominant narrative is branded as dangerous or immoral. The label changes, but the underlying mechanism stays the same. This makes sense when you think about human psychology. Tribalism is hardwired into us. Religions simply give tribes a sacred story to unite around. Once you have a sacred story, anyone who refuses to honor it feels like a threat. The reaction isn't rational, but it's deeply emotional. And this brings us to another subtle reason people hate atheists. They symbolize freedom. To believe without evidence, many people have to suppress doubt. Doubt is always lurking, and it can be frightening. Meeting someone who has not only entertained doubt but embraced it forces people to confront questions they've buried. It's easier to hate the doubter than to face your own uncertainty. This is why discussions about belief can feel so volatile. They're rarely about logic alone. They're about identity, mortality, power, and fear. No wonder the responses can be so intense. But here's the hopeful part. Even though hostility toward atheists is widespread, it's not permanent. Data shows that in countries where secularism becomes more visible, trust in atheists rises over time. People learn, slowly, that their stereotypes don't match reality. Younger generations who grow up with more diverse perspectives are often less suspicious than older ones. Familiarity and exposure gradually wear away the prejudice. The more people see that kindness, honesty, and community exist without religion, the harder it becomes to maintain the old fears. And each person who lives openly without belief helps chip away at those stereotypes. And so, after peeling back all these layers, the question of why people hate atheists starts to look very different. It isn't about evidence, because evidence shows that non-believers live moral, meaningful, and compassionate lives. It isn't about behavior, because atheists work, raise families, help neighbors, and contribute to society just like anyone else. The hostility comes from something deeper, from fear of uncertainty, from cultural conditioning, from the need for community symbols, from the defense of power. Atheists don't threaten morality. They threaten the illusion that morality needs divine approval. They don't undermine meaning. They remind us that meaning is ours to create. They don't weaken community. They show that belonging can be built on honesty and mutual respect instead of shared rituals alone. The hatred, then, is never really about atheists. It's about what they represent to others. A mirror of doubt, a challenge to authority, a sign that there's more than one way to live a full human life. And if there's one lesson to draw from this, it's that prejudice thrives in ignorance but crumbles in familiarity. Every conversation, every friendship, every act of kindness from someone who doesn't believe chips away at the old stereotypes. The more visible non-believers are, the harder it becomes to sustain the myths that fuel hostility. In the end, hatred toward atheists is built on stories that aren't true. And the best way to undo those stories isn't to shout louder, but simply to live openly, honestly, and compassionately. Because the reality of everyday life speaks louder than dogma. So why do people hate atheists? Because they've been taught to. But like every form of prejudice, that teaching can be unlearned. It already is, slowly, generation by generation. And as it fades, what will remain is not fear, but a clearer understanding. That morality, meaning, and humanity are not gifts handed down from the sky. They're things we build together, here on the ground.